Because you clicked on this video, I'm just going to go out on a limb and assume that you are already very familiar with Quake II. So I'm not going to bore you by going into the history and the details of that game. This video is obviously focused more on Quake IV, more specifically how it relates back to Quake II. Now, assuming that you aren't a Quake player, I'll give you the quick rundown of Quake II, which is by far the much more renowned and cherished game out of the two. Quake II is one of the most legendary arena-style shooters of all time, with fast movement and even faster combat. Pair that with one of the most legendary gaming soundtracks of all time, and you've got the makings for a massive first-person shooter success. In fact, Quake's multiplayer is still a massive esport today, hence events like QuakeCon. After Quake II came Quake III, which is hoping to capitalize on the vast multiplayer success of Quake II. Quake III, or Quake III Arena, is a multiplayer-only game and is often regarded as the best arena shooter of all time. And after Quake III, you know, some things happen, you know, as you do. And then you had Quake IV, which came after and was less successful. Quake IV was not developed by the developers of Quake I and II. It was developed by Raven Software.
We're here at Jeff Degenhardt's cubicle, doing a little cubicle interview. Hey Jeff, how's it going?
Hey Jason, I'm going to show you around my cubicle a little bit here with Sean giving me some music background and Eagle Sword to point some things out.
Go for it.
So I guess we'll start over here. I got my Sega Saturn. I like to play some Guardian Heroes on there.
Nice.
Some spare time I have once in a while. Down here I've got a box full of coffee creamers that somebody else didn't want.
Quake IV kind of came and gone. Its multiplayer was popular for a time, but later died out, as I will talk about in this video. Whenever the Quake games are discussed, Quake IV seems to never be mentioned, and I'm personally curious as to why that is, and I'm sure that's why you clicked on this video yourself. Unless this just popped up because you're subscribed to me, in which case, I don't know why you are, but thank you. In this video, I hope to explore the many criticisms that Quake IV has in relation to Quake II. I, for one, do not believe that Quake IV is that bad of a game, however, I will be addressing most of the biggest criticisms that I have, and I hope you'll begin to understand why Quake IV is more or less the black sheep of the Quake franchise, even more so than the failure of Quake Champions, although that might not be a failure for very long. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. If I'm going to be talking poorly about Quake IV, it's only right, and I talk about things that are good about Quake IV, things that I liked about it that might have even been better than they were in Quake II, and there are a number of them. For example, I prefer the enemies in Quake IV over the ones in Quake II. Many of the enemies are the same, but some of them got reworked, such as the Gunner or the Iron Maiden. I also like the reworking of the Quake II weapon. In Quake IV, the railgun, you can now zoom in addition to the machine gun. The chain gun, or the nail gun in Quake IV, has a little bit of a locking feature to it, which is nice. In Quake IV's grenade launcher was far more viable than it was in Quake II. In addition, I massively preferred the boss battles in Quake IV over the boss battles in Quake II. Quake II only really had one true boss battle, but it had a bunch of little mini-bosses that you can or can't consider bosses depending on what you think. However, in Quake IV there are actual bosses separated by cutscenes, and all of them are different and interesting to fight, in addition to very fun. I particularly like the fight with the Nexus Guardian, because you see glimpses of him for several hours before you actually fight him, which builds up the suspense very nicely. There are a whole host of other things that Quake IV does better than Quake II, but most of them are rather small, and if I went into them all, we'd be here until tomorrow. So I'm just going to get into the meat and potatoes of what you obviously clicked on this video for, being the many criticisms that Quake IV has. For one thing, the playstyle in Quake IV is radically different from the playstyle that you would have experienced in Quake II. Quake IV is far less run and gun and is a lot more structured and organized. I guess the way to define that better is that Quake II is an arena shooter, whereas Quake IV is more of a cinematic shooter. What that means is that Quake IV has lots of cutscenes and scripted events, in addition to being part of a squad. Being part of a squad in Quake IV wasn't that big of a deal, however, it comes off as just an excuse to have more missions in the game, seeing as how there are 9 or more escort missions in Quake IV, which none of them were particularly good. However, it is helpful to have a squad to repair your health and armor if you do get beat up. Overall, though, I think the addition of the squad mechanic was negative for the game, although it does have its perks. My personal biggest criticism with the game was that they tried and failed to implement elements of Quake II. For example, many of the enemies, the vast majority of enemies in fact, from Quake IV were originally in Quake II. That sounds perfectly fine and good until you realize that some changes were made to the combat system in Quake IV, as I had already said. The biggest noticeable change that you realize right when you start up the game is that your movement speed is horrendously slow. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely playable, but it doesn't allow you to dodge projectiles very well. Not to mention that strafe and rocket jumping, two things that Quake are legendary for, are completely removed from Quake 4's single-player game. What this leaves you with are Quake II enemies that are designed around the player having a different movement speed and set of abilities, being put up next to a very slow, very tender target. Consider these two clips of the Berserker in the two Quake games. On the right is the Berserker from Quake II, and on the left is the Berserker from Quake IV. In Quake II, my movement speed allows me to dodge the Berserker as the game intended. However, on the left, you have the Berserker from Quake IV, who comes out of the door at the speed of sound to the point where if you are not Jesus or Dennis Fong, you probably are going to get hit. I, for one, have not been able to dodge this Berserker in all 3 of my playthroughs. Raven pulls this trick a lot, where you get ambushed by enemies right when you go through a door, however your movement speed does not allow you to dodge them at all. Your movement speed is increased later in the game through strugification, and it does become easier to dodge certain enemies and their projectiles. But the default movement speed from Quake II still far surpasses it, even with the upgrade. I don't know who decided it would be a good idea to put several vehicle stages in a Quake game, but they did it, and they are all horrendous. They are either way too easy as to where you can beat them blindfolded, or so stupid frustratingly hard that the only fun you could possibly have is just by running through the stage so that you can get back out of the vehicle, which is something I find myself doing very often. Another criticism I have is that Quake IV has a pretty piss-poor sound design. I mean, just listen to what Sonic Mayhem did for Quake II's soundtrack, and then listen to what Quake IV had. Yeah, it's a pretty massive letdown. Speaking of letdowns, Quake IV's multiplayer was also pretty disappointing. I will give them credit though that Quake IV's multiplayer was very true to the original Quake format, with movement patterns such as bunny hopping and strafe jumping being in the multiplayer platform. These observations were just made by the internet though, because I've never actually been able to play a multiplayer game of Quake IV. There are either no servers available, or the 1, maybe 2 servers that are available and are barely populated require mods to run. and I was not about to go and install foreign content onto my computer so I can play Quake IV online. I'm sorry, but it's just not worth it. All in all, here's the big question. Should you buy Quake IV? Well, yeah, you should buy Quake IV. But you should also buy Quake II. Why should I buy Quake II? Because you will have a good, probably even better experience playing through Quake II than Quake IV. Do note, however, that the Steam version of Quake II does not feature the godly soundtrack I was talking about, for one reason or another, but you can pretty easily mod it back in. The second reason you should buy Quake II is because it is really affordable on Steam, and for the mass amount of fun you're going to be getting from playing it, there's no reason not to pick it up. So in conclusion, Quake IV is by no means a bad game, but compared to its predecessors, and even the games that came after it, it's very hard to say that Quake IV was as good as the classics. I'm Cadetri, and I'll see you in the next video.